Provo, Utah is a thriving modern city. Because it is home to Brigham Young University, many assume it is a college town. Few realize it really began with a pioneer fort on the banks of the river. Provo's story started in 1849. More and more settlers were arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, and things were getting a little crowded. With the United States border growing ever closer and the California gold rush increasing interest in the West, Latter-day Saint church leaders began to talk about expanding outward.
Several hundred houses are built, and the Salt Lake Valley is settled for 60 miles north and south. We are about to establish a colony of about 30 families in Utah Valley and hope soon to explore the valley's 300 miles south, and also the country as far as the Gulf of California with the view of settlement and a seaport. Quorum of the 12 Apostles report.
Settling Utah Valley was a trial experiment in the larger scheme of things. If successful, it would open up the way to settlement still further south and provide an immediate solution to the overcrowding of the Salt Lake Valley.
With this in mind, 33 men were selected to go to Utah Valley. Ultimately, 29 would accept. On April 1, 1849, the settlers arrived at the Provo River, where they were stopped by Engatawatz, a young Ute warrior.
After some negotiation, he agreed to let them proceed. But he was not the first Indian the settlers would meet that day.
We crossed to the south side of the Provo River. There was plenty of grass all around us. We turned the oxen out to feed and prepared our dinner. In a little while, Elk and Eagle, the war chiefs, came riding up with about 40 warriors in war paint and feathers, giving the war whoop and yelling hideously. They kept up their whooping and dancing all afternoon and night. Our men all stood guard over the cattle and wagons, expecting an attack every minute. In the morning, Dimmock Huntington talked to them, and finally they made peace again. John Clark.
2 days after their arrival, the settlers selected a plot of land near the Provo River and began to build Fort Utah, the first permanent structure in Utah Valley. Although today the site of the fort is somewhere beneath I-15, a rough facsimile was later built in Fort Utah Park.
The actual fort was made of 2 rows of 11 houses with a gate at each end. In the center was a platform with a 6-pounder cannon mounted on top. The gaps between the houses were filled with pickets, with a corral on the east side and private corrals behind each house. Once the fort was complete, the men sent for their families to join them. The first school in Utah Valley would be held in this fort, although the teachers were sporadic.
Aunt Zina Young came down from Salt Lake City and pitched her tent and took up school and taught an ABC class. That was my first schooling. Anna Clark.
The fort's value as a refuge was demonstrated almost immediately, and it became a regular stop for travelers along the southern route to California. Provo was also a gathering place for the local Indians, especially in the springtime when the fish began to run through Provo River.
While these bands of Indians met each spring for fishing, they engaged in good sporting as well: horse racing, trading, gambling, foot racing, wrestling, etc. Some spent weeks here, and I lost no time idle myself, and I enjoyed their games and learned much of their language and made friends. George Washington Bean.
Not all the interactions between the Indians and settlers were as friendly, however, and near the end of 1849 things became precarious, fueled by misunderstandings on both sides.
The Indians were a continual torment and for years kept making attacks on the settlers, and the men were being continually called to go in pursuit of them so that our lives were constantly in jeopardy. We did not know at what time we would be attacked by them. Mary Park Brockbank.
The fort provided temporary safety, but concerns ran high. Messengers were sent to Salt Lake City asking for direction.
Leaders realized that losing the fort would mean losing access to the fish and irrigation water in Provo River. It would also mean losing the possibility of future settlements further south and the entire Salt Lake Valley as well.
We have to maintain that ground or vacate this. If we yield in this instance, we have to yield this land. If the brethren wake up and do right, all the gates of hell can't prevail against them. Brigham Young.
With the support of church leaders and the arrival of backup from the Salt Lake Valley, the settlers ultimately decided to hold their ground and refuse to retreat. By 1850, a hard-won peace had returned to Utah Valley, and the fort had outlived its usefulness. Flooding was frequent due to the location near the river, and the ground around the fort was too alkali for good crops.
The people commenced to move out of the fort and build on their city lots. Our population increased almost daily. George Washington Bean.
In April of 1850, when Brigham Young came to visit Provo, he selected the land for a larger fort, built on higher ground, where Provo's North Park is today. New cabins were built, a new schoolhouse was erected, and the original fort was abandoned.
Over time, Fort Utah vanished and was almost completely forgotten. The land was sold, and the interstate now runs over the site. Today, few people have ever heard of Fort Utah. Even fewer know of its profound impact on the settlement of Utah. Places like Springville, Spanish Fork, Lehigh, and Linden were all settled within a year of the successful settlement of Provo.
Echoes of the fort remain throughout Utah, in park names, memorials, and murals. People may forget, but the legacy that Fort Utah left will never die.